Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we uncover the quiet scandal beneath Arlington's most sacred grave, because the man America honored as every soldier may have been someone's son, someone's husband, and the government may have known exactly whose. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes, if they are not already closed. Let the weight of the day begin to soften at the edges. Breathe in slowly, and let the breath go. Tonight we are going to travel together to a particular autumn morning, more than 100 years ago, to a hillside in Virginia where the grass was still green and the air carried the first cool suggestion of November. A single casket, draped in a flag, rested on a caisson drawn by 6 gray horses. Around it, the world held its breath. And no one, not a single person standing there, knew who lay inside. Part 1: A Nation Coming Back to Itself. Picture, for a moment, the United States in the spring of 1919. The war, the one they were already calling the Great War, though no one yet imagined there would be a second to follow it, was over. The armistice had come on November 11, 1918, and the guns that had rattled the bones of Europe for 4 years had finally, blessedly, gone silent. Across the ocean, in the shattered countryside of France and Belgium, soldiers who had survived were beginning the long process of walking away from the trenches, from the mud, from the wire, from the things they had seen and done and endured. They were washing their faces. They were writing letters home. Some of them were weeping quietly in the dark because they did not yet know how to feel anything else. Back in America, there was celebration. There were ticker-tape parades in church bells and streets crowded with people who clutched one another and laughed and cried all at once. Cities glittered with it. Flags were hung from every window. Children who had never met their fathers were told that Daddy was coming home, and in homes across the country women sat by windows and listened for a familiar step on the front walk. But there was something else, too. Something quieter and heavier that moves beneath the celebration like a current under bright water. More than 116,000 American soldiers had died. Not all of them from battle. Disease, especially the influenza pandemic that swept through the world in 1918 and 1919, had killed tens of thousands in the camps and the hospitals and on the troopships crossing the Atlantic. But battle had taken its share as well. The Western Front, those miles of contested earth between the German lines and the Allied lines, had consumed young men at a rate that is almost impossible to comprehend in its quietest telling. Artillery fire. Poison gas. Machine guns. Snipers. The weight of mud and exhaustion and cold. The particular loneliness of a man far from home, uncertain whether any letter he wrote would ever arrive. Of those 116,000 dead, a great many had been identified. Their families had been notified by telegram, that hateful piece of paper that a boy would bring to the door and a mother would open with shaking hands. In some cases, bodies had been recovered from the battlefield quickly enough that identification was possible. Dog tags. Personal effects. The testimony of a fellow soldier who had been nearby. These men had names, and their names would be carved into stone, eventually, and their families would have something to hold on to. But not all of them. The nature of industrial warfare on the scale that the First World War represented, meant that some men simply disappeared. The earth swallowed them. Artillery shells, which could weigh hundreds of pounds and arrived without warning, could obliterate a human body entirely. A man might be walking forward one moment and simply cease to exist in the next, leaving behind nothing that anyone could later gather and name. Other men drowned in the mud of the Ypres salient, that terrible region of Belgium where the water table was so high and the shelling so constant that the ground itself became a kind of slow, cold grave. Still others were buried in the chaos of battle, in makeshift graves that were later destroyed by subsequent fighting, their markers lost, their locations forgotten. These were the missing. The United States Army counted them carefully. Thousands of them. Men who had gone to war and not come back in any form that could be recognized, claimed, or returned. Their families waited and hoped and wrote letters to the War Department asking, sometimes for years, whether there might be some mistake, whether perhaps their boy had been found after all, whether some soldier who had survived might know something about what had happened. For most of these families, no satisfying answer ever came. Now, across the ocean in Britain and France, among the countries that had been fighting since 1914, whose losses dwarfed even America's, this problem of the unidentified dead had been occupying people's minds for some time. The British had lost more than 700,000 soldiers whose bodies were never recovered or identified. The French losses were staggering, nearly 1.5 million dead in total, with a vast and uncountable portion among the missing. These were not just statistics. They were the sons and husbands and brothers of families who came home to a silence that never quite filled in. In Britain, an idea had been quietly growing since the final year of the war. It began, as many powerful ideas do, not in a government office or a military headquarters, but in the mind of an ordinary person who was paying attention. His name was David Railton, and he was an army chaplain. He had served on the Western Front, and he had seen more than any person should be asked to see. He had said prayers over bodies that no one could name. He had watched men die in the dark, far from anything familiar, without knowing whether anyone would ever learn what had happened to them. And he had thought, with the particular clarity that comes from being very close to suffering for a very long time, about what might be done to honor the nameless. In August of 1920, Railton wrote a letter to the Dean of Westminster Abbey. His idea was simple in its form and profound in its implication. Select one body, one unidentified body, from the battlefields of France. Bring it home to England. Bury it in Westminster Abbey, in the most sacred space in the nation, with full military honors and the presence of the king. Let this one unknown man represent all the unknown men, all the men whose families would never have a grave to visit, a name on a stone, a place to bring flowers. France had done something similar, on the very same day, interring an unknown soldier beneath the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. America watched. And America began to think about doing the same. Part 2: The decision to honor the nameless. In Washington, in the months that followed the British and French ceremonies, a conversation was growing. It was the kind of conversation that takes place in many rooms at once, in Congress, in veterans organizations, in newspaper editorial offices, in the quiet of private homes where families of missing soldiers had been living with their grief for 2 years now without resolution. The war had left the country changed in ways that were still being understood. The young men who had come back, and so many had come back, were different from the boys who had gone. They had seen things that did not fit into the ordinary rhythms of American life, and some of them were struggling in ways that had no name yet. What would later be called shell shock, and then combat fatigue, and eventually post-traumatic stress disorder, was something these men and their families navigated largely alone, without language for it, without systems of support, trying to reintegrate into a country that wanted to celebrate the victory without dwelling too long on the cost. The families of the dead were navigating their own particular grief. For most families, there had been some form of notification. The War Department's record-keeping, though imperfect, had been diligent about informing next of kin of identified deaths. But for thousands of families, the status of their loved one remained uncertain. Missing in action was a category that left a person suspended between grief and hope, unable to mourn fully, unable to let go. Hamilton Fish III was a New York congressman and a veteran of the war who had served with the 369th Infantry Regiment, the famous Harlem Hellfighters, one of the most decorated American units of the entire conflict. Fish was a man who understood loss in a personal way, and he understood the particular agony of the missing. In March of 1921, he introduced a resolution in the House of Representatives calling for Congress to authorize the return to the United States of the body of an unidentified American soldier who had died in France, and the burial of that soldier with full honors at Arlington National Cemetery. The resolution passed. The Senate concurred. President Warren G. Harding signed it into law. And the process began. But the process of choosing the body was not simple. It could not simply be any body. It had to be genuinely unidentified, not merely unnamed, but truly and irrecoverably unknown, so that the symbol would hold for everyone. If there were any possibility of later establishing the identity of the chosen soldier, then the symbolic purpose of the burial would be undermined. Families would begin to wonder. Some would begin to hope, and then to press for testing, and the quiet, inclusive dignity of the unknown would fracture into something contested and painful. The American Graves Registration Service, which had been doing the painstaking work of locating, identifying, and recording the American dead in France and Belgium since the end of the war, was tasked with selecting the candidates. They identified 4 bodies, 4 sets of remains that had been thoroughly examined by experts and for which no identification was possible by any available means. These 4 had been gathered from 4 different areas where Americans had fought: the Somme, the Aisne-Marne region, the Meuse-Argonne sector, and Saint-Mihiel. Each represented a different landscape of the American experience in France. The Meuse-Argonne was the largest American offensive of the war, a grinding, costly campaign in the autumn of 1918 in which more than 26,000 Americans had died in 6 weeks. Saint-Mihiel was the first major American-led offensive, a moment of pride and terrible cost. The Aisne-Marne region included the fighting around Belleau Wood, which had become a kind of legend in the young Marine Corps. 6 weeks of brutal close-quarters combat that had stunned the Germans and established the Marine Corps' reputation for ferocity in the American imagination. The Somme was a name that, even now, carries a weight that is difficult to articulate, a name synonymous with mass death on a scale that rewrote what people thought war meant. From each of these regions, 1 set of unidentified remains was selected, carefully and respectfully disinterred, placed in identical caskets, and transported to the city of Chalon-sur-Marne in France, where the selection ceremony would take place. The ceremony of selection was designed, above all, to be random. No one involved could know which body came from which region. No one involved could have any information that might allow preference or prejudice to operate. The choice had to be made in a state of genuine unknowing. It had to be, in its deepest sense, a choice made not by human calculation but by something more like fate. The man chosen to make the selection was Sergeant Edward F. Younger. He was a decorated combat veteran who had been wounded in action. He was chosen not for any particular rank or title but because he was a soldier, a man who had been there, who understood from inside his own body what the men in those caskets had experienced. On October 23, 1921, Sergeant Younger entered the room where the 4 identical caskets rested, side by side, draped in American flags. He carried a spray of white roses. The room was quiet. The other soldiers present stood at attention. And Sergeant Younger walked slowly along the row of caskets, and then he stopped, and he placed the white roses on one of them. He later said that he could not entirely explain why he chose that particular casket. He had simply felt drawn to it. He had stood there, in the silence, with 4 identical flags before him, and something had guided his hand. The casket he chose was the one containing the remains from the Meuse-Argonne sector. He was, from that moment, the unknown soldier. Part 3: The Journey Home. There is something about the ocean crossing that carries its own particular weight in this story. Think of the soldiers who had made that crossing going the other direction eastward, across the Atlantic, in the spring and summer of 1917 and into 1918. The troop ships were crowded, and the men stood at railings in the early morning watching the American coastline recede until it was just a suggestion of something at the edge of the water, and then nothing at all. Many of them had never been more than 50 miles from home before. Many of them were barely out of boyhood. They had signed up because it seemed right, or because their friends had signed up, or because someone in their town had made them feel that duty required it. They had gone with high hearts, most of them, or something close to it, a mixture of fear and pride and the particular excitement of young men who have not yet learned what war actually is. Now, in late October of 1921, the ship carrying the unknown soldiers' remains made the crossing going the other direction. Westward. Homeward. The vessel was the USS Olympia, a cruiser with a history of its own. It was the flagship of Admiral George Dewey at the Battle of Manila Bay in 1898, one of the defining naval actions of the Spanish-American War. The Olympia was already a piece of American military history, and that history gave the homeward journey an extra layer of meaning. This was not just any ship carrying the remains back across the Atlantic. This was a ship that had itself been part of the American story of war and sacrifice. The casket was placed in the Olympia's main cabin, where it rested under a constant honor guard throughout the voyage. Sailors rotated through the watch, standing at attention for their hours beside a man whose name they did not know. The ship moved through the Atlantic swells, through weather that was sometimes rough and sometimes calm, through nights when the stars were visible and nights when the ocean was all darkness. The Olympia arrived in the waters of the Chesapeake Bay on November 9, 1921. 2 days before the ceremony. She was escorted by a fleet of Navy vessels, a procession on the water that announced, in the language of flags and guns and slow, deliberate movement, that something of profound significance was approaching. The casket was transferred to a Navy tugboat called the Sylph, which carried it up the Potomac River to the Washington Navy Yard. And as the Sylph moved up the Potomac, that wide, dark, American river, people gathered on the banks to watch. Not in the way people gather for a spectacle, not with the noise and energy of celebration, but in the quieter way that people gather when they sense that something is passing that deserves their stillness. At the Navy Yard, the casket was received with full military honors and placed in a horse-drawn caisson, a 2-wheeled, artillery ammunition wagon that had become, by convention, the vehicle by which fallen soldiers of rank were transported, and the procession moved through the streets of Washington to the Capitol building. The casket was placed in the rotunda of the Capitol to lie in state. This is an honor reserved for the most significant figures in American public life: presidents, generals, chief justices. In the history of the Republic at that point, it had happened only a handful of times. And now it was happening for a man with no name. For 2 days, November 9th and 10th, the public was invited to pay their respects. The doors of the Capitol Rotunda were open, and people came. Thousands upon thousands of them. They came in from the streets of Washington and from the surrounding countryside and from cities further away, people who had taken trains and driven automobiles and walked long distances to be part of this moment. They came carrying flowers. They came carrying nothing at all. They came in their good clothes and their working clothes. Veterans came in their uniforms, some of them still young, some of them already beginning to show the gray that grief and experience can put in a man's hair before his time. And for the families of the missing, for those thousands of families who still had no answer, who still sat with the particular uncertainty of a loved one who was neither confirmed dead nor confirmed alive in any documentation, there was something else in this moment. There was the possibility, however remote, that the man in that casket might be theirs. That the son or husband they had lost might be the one who had been chosen. That the grave they would be able to visit at Arlington might, in some sense, be a grave for their loved one too. It was this possibility, this deliberate, sustained, carefully protected uncertainty that was the deepest purpose of the entire undertaking. Part 4, the morning of November 11th. November 11th, 1921, was a Thursday. It was cool but clear, the kind of autumn day in the mid-Atlantic states that carries a blue sky so precise and light it seems almost handmade. The trees at Arlington had turned and some of them had begun to drop their leaves, but the hillside was still green underneath, the grass still soft from the autumn rains, the graves of earlier soldiers arranged in their rows with the quiet geometry of a place that takes its responsibilities seriously. Washington had been filling with people for days. Hotels were crowded. Streets that were normally manageable with the traffic of a mid-sized city were now dense with people moving on foot, by automobile, by streetcar. Visitors had come from every state. Veterans organizations had organized travel for their members. Gold Star mothers, women who had lost sons in the war and who wore a particular service flag with a gold star on it as a symbol of their sacrifice, had come in groups, many of them old enough that the journey had been difficult, but committed enough that difficulty had not deterred them. The ceremony was to include not just American dignitaries but foreign ones as well. The British had sent a representative. The French had sent Marshal Ferdinand Foch himself, the supreme commander of the Allied forces during the war, the man who had coordinated the final offensive that had broken the German lines and led to the armistice. His presence gave the day an international dimension, a sense that what was being honored was not only American sacrifice but the larger sacrifice of the alliance, the shared cost of a war that had consumed an entire generation across multiple continents. The procession began at the Capitol, where the casket was lifted from the catafalque on which it had rested and placed once again on its caisson. 6 matched gray horses drew the caisson slowly through the streets. Behind it walked the escort, soldiers and sailors and Marines in their dress uniforms, moving in the measured step of military ceremony. Behind them came the dignitaries, President Warren G. Harding, former President Woodrow Wilson, who was ill and frail but had insisted on being present, riding in an open carriage because he could not easily walk. Chief Justice William Howard Taft, who was also a former president. Generals and admirals. Members of Congress. Foreign ambassadors and military representatives. And then, behind all of them, the veterans. Men who had fought in this war and in previous wars, men in uniform and men in civilian clothes, men who walked steadily and men who leaned on canes, men who kept their eyes forward and men who wept quietly as they moved through the streets of their capital city behind the casket of a man who might have been standing next to them in the mud somewhere in France 3 years before. As the procession crossed the Memorial Bridge over the Potomac, a bridge that was itself still under construction, though it had been opened for this occasion specifically, and entered the grounds of Arlington National Cemetery, the sound of cannon fire began. A salute. The guns fired at measured intervals, each report rolling over the hillside and across the river and fading into the blue air over Virginia. Arlington National Cemetery had a history that was itself steeped in the particular complexities of American sacrifice. The land had belonged, before the Civil War, to the Curtis Lee family. Specifically, it was the estate of Robert E. Lee, the general who would lead the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. When Virginia seceded and Lee chose to follow his state rather than stay with the Union Army he had served for 30 years, the Union Army occupied his estate almost immediately. It became a headquarters, a camp, a hospital. And when the Union dead began to accumulate in numbers that overwhelmed the existing cemeteries, it became, in 1864, a burial ground, not least because Union Quartermaster General Montgomery Meigs, who despised Lee for what he saw as an act of treason, ordered graves dug in the rose garden of Lee's mansion to ensure that the land could never be returned to the family. By 1921, Arlington was already the resting place of thousands of soldiers who had died in the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, and the Indian Wars. It was a place consecrated by loss, layered with it, every acre of its green hillside carrying beneath it the weight of someone's grief. The plaza in front of the Memorial Amphitheater, a great open marble space that had been built in the years since the war, was where the final ceremony would take place. The amphitheater itself was filled to capacity, and the plaza outside was crowded with people who had come too late for seats, or who had not been invited inside, but who stood in the cool November air and listened to the sounds of the ceremony drifting out to them through the marble columns. President Harding spoke. His words were the words of the moment, words about sacrifice, about duty, about the debt that a nation owed to those who had given everything in its name. They were sincere words, mostly, the words of a man who understood that the occasion demanded something larger than politics, something that reached toward the permanent and the universal. But it was not the words that would remain in memory. It was the silence that came after them. Part 5: The Burial and its Symbols. When the time came for the burial itself, the ceremony moved from speech to silence to the particular language of ritual that communicates what words cannot. The casket, still draped in its flag, was carried by pallbearers, men chosen from among the most decorated veterans, men whose uniforms were heavy with medals, men who had themselves survived experiences they rarely spoke of, to the tomb of the unknown soldier, which had been prepared in the plaza in front of the Memorial Amphitheater. The tomb itself, at this point, was not yet the marble monument it would later become. The permanent monument, the great rectangular block of Colorado marble with its carved figures of peace, victory, and valor, and its inscription reading "Here rests in honored glory an American soldier known but to God," would not be completed until 1932. On November 11, 1921, what was present was a rectangular vault set into the ground of the plaza, awaiting its permanent covering, a place in the process of becoming what it would eventually be. But the simplicity of it, at that moment, may have been appropriate. Because what was being created was something that had never existed before in the United States. There was no template for it, no tradition to draw on, no established form. What was happening in that plaza was being made for the first time, and the making of it was its own kind of statement, a statement that said, "We do not have words adequate to this, and so we are making a gesture instead, and the gesture will have to carry the meaning." Decorated military officers placed medals on the casket. Marshal Foch, on behalf of France, placed the Médaille Militaire, France's highest military honor, and the Croix de Guerre with Palm. The Belgian government had sent the Croix de Guerre as well. Romania sent the Virtue Militara. The Kingdom of Czechoslovakia sent the Czechoslovak War Cross. Italy, Poland, and other nations followed with their own military decorations. The president of each country, through his representatives, was saying, "This man, this unknown, nameless man, fought for something we also fought for, and we honor him as our own." President Harding placed the Medal of Honor on the casket, and then the Distinguished Service Cross. These were the highest military decorations the United States could bestow, and they were being bestowed on a man who would never be known, who would never hear them read aloud with his name attached, who was receiving them not as an individual but as a representative of all the individuals who could not be named. It is worth pausing here to consider the specific strangeness and beauty of this gesture. Military medals, in the ordinary course of things, are given to specific men for specific acts. The Medal of Honor requires a citation, a document that names the recipient and describes, in formal language, the action for which the medal is awarded. The citation says, "This man, on this day, in this place, did this thing." It is an act of naming. It is an act of witness. It is the official record asserting that this particular human being did something extraordinary and that the nation has seen it and will remember. But what happens when the man has no name? What happens when the citation cannot be written because there is nothing to cite except the fact of dying in service, which was shared by so many men that it cannot be attributed to any one of them specifically? What happens, it seems, is that the medal is given to the absence itself. The nation awards its highest honor to the space where a man used to be, and in doing so acknowledges that the honor belongs to all the spaces where all the men used to be. The medal on the casket was not for one man. It was for all the men who could not be named. It was the country's way of saying, "We cannot reach all of you, and we know we cannot reach all of you, but we are reaching in the direction of all of you, and we want you to know it." The bugler played taps. If you have ever heard taps, the haunting, simple bugle call that the American military uses at funerals and at the lowering of the flag, you will understand why it was the right sound for this moment. It is 24 notes. That is all. 24 notes in a sequence that lasts about a minute. And in that minute something happens in the chest of almost everyone who hears it. Something loosens. Something that has been held very tight begins to let go. The notes drifted out over the cemetery and over the river and over the city, and for a moment everything else was quiet. Then came the rifle volley. 3 volleys fired by the honor guard, the sound sharp and definitive, saying, "This is done. This is complete. This man is in the ground now, in American ground, and he will remain here." The flag was folded, that precise, ceremonial triangular folding that takes 13 folds and results in a tight blue bundle showing only the stars, and presented to the Secretary of War, who received it on behalf of the nation. And it was done. Or rather, it was done in one sense. In another sense, it was only beginning. Part 6, Who might he have been? This is the question that has lived inside the story from the very beginning, and it is worth settling into it now, in the quiet. Who was he? Not in the sense of a name that could be definitively established, we will come to that question separately, because it has its own complicated history. But in the sense of, who might he have been? What kind of man might have lain within that casket? What life might have carried him from somewhere in America to the Meuse-Argonne sector in France, to the moment of his death, to the honor guard on the Olympia crossing the Atlantic, to the Marble Plaza at Arlington? The Meuse-Argonne offensive, from which the chosen remains came, was fought between September 26 and November 11, 1918. It was the largest military operation in American history up to that point. More than 1 million American soldiers were eventually involved. The terrain was difficult: forested ridges, narrow valleys, German positions that had been fortified over 4 years of occupation, deep belts of wire and concrete bunkers, and artillery positions that had to be taken, often, at terrible cost. The Americans who fought there came from everywhere. The draft had been brought in deep, reaching into every state, every city, every small town. They came from the industrial North, from the steel towns of Pennsylvania, the mills of Ohio, the factories of Michigan and Illinois. They came from the agricultural South, from the red clay farms of Georgia, the cotton fields of Alabama, the hill country of Tennessee. They came from the ranches of the West, from the fishing villages of New England, from the crowded immigrant neighborhoods of New York and Chicago and Boston, where the sons of men who had come from Italy and Poland and Hungary and Russia and Ireland and a dozen other places were proving their Americanness by fighting under the American flag. The average age of American soldiers in the Great War was somewhere around 23 or 24 years. Many were younger. Boys of 18 and 19 who had enlisted with a parent's signature, or sometimes without it, who had gone through the rapid training programs that the Army had assembled in the camps scattered across the country. Camps with names like Camp Upton in New York, Camp Meade in Maryland, Camp Lewis in Washington, Camp Gordon in Georgia. Places where young men from one region of the country met young men from entirely different regions and found themselves thrown together in the particular intimacy of shared hardship. They trained on rifles and on the new weapons of this new kind of war: machine guns, hand grenades, the bayonet used in close combat. They were taught how to read the landscape for danger and how to move through a trench system and how to wear the gas mask that might save their life if the wind shifted the wrong way. They were taught military discipline and military hierarchy, and most of them adjusted to it with the adaptability of the young. Then they crossed the ocean and arrived in France, and they were assigned to units, and they moved up toward the front, and the landscape became increasingly broken. First the normal French countryside with its farmhouses and its winding roads and its poplar trees, and then the degraded zone behind the lines where traffic and heavy use had churned the roads into mud, and then finally the forward areas where the land itself had been destroyed so completely that it no longer resembled anything a person raised in the American countryside would have recognized as Earth. The shell craters. The burned stumps of what had been forests. The mud, always the mud, that particular gray-brown mud of the Western Front that was not simply wet earth but a kind of substance that seemed almost alive in its capacity to slow and trap and swallow. The smell of it, which combined the rot of destroyed organic matter with the chemical smell of explosives and, underneath it all, the smell of death, which is something that once a person has encountered it they do not easily forget. The man in the casket had been part of this. He had walked through this landscape. He had slept in it, eaten in it, kept watch in it. He had been afraid in it, almost certainly, because fear is not something that courage eliminates but something that courage is exercised in the presence of. He had probably written letters home. The postal system for American troops in France was reasonably efficient, and soldiers wrote constantly, to their families and to their sweethearts and to their friends. He had probably received letters in return, and read them in whatever shelter was available, in whatever light could be found. He had died somewhere in those 67 days of fighting, somewhere in the forest ridges and valley floors of the Meuse-Argonne. And afterward, in the chaos of continuing battle and the subsequent work of locating the dead, he had been found, or the remains of him had been found, without any means of identification attached. His dog tags, which might have identified him, were gone. Perhaps they were removed by a comrade who wanted to send them home to the man's family and was then killed or wounded before he could do so. Perhaps the violence of his death had scattered or destroyed them. Perhaps they had simply been lost in the mud. He had been buried, at first, in one of the battlefield cemeteries that the Graves Registration Service established as fighting progressed temporary places, marked with simple wooden crosses or stakes, where the dead were laid in the ground with as much ceremony as circumstances allowed. His grave had been marked unknown. And later, when the Graves Registration Service came through to consolidate and properly record the burials, the notation had been confirmed. There was nothing here that could identify this man. Whoever he had been, whatever name his mother had called him, whatever place he had called home, whatever particular quality of laughter or silence or stubbornness or gentleness had made him himself, all of that was now enclosed within the word unknown, which is not a name but which would, from November 11, 1921 onward, become something very close to one. Part 7: The Families Who Wondered. Among the vast crowd that gathered in Washington on November 11, 1921, and among the millions more who followed the proceedings through newspaper accounts and, for the first time in American history, through radio broadcasts, the event was covered live on the radio. Another piece of the story's particular modernity: there were families. Families of the missing. It is difficult to overstate what the years between 1918 and 1921 had been like for these families. The war ended in November 1918, and the process of accounting for the dead, thorough, careful, conducted by hundreds of Graves Registration Service personnel across hundreds of square miles of former battlefield, had been ongoing ever since. The War Department had been sending out letters and telegrams, notifying families of identification when it was possible, maintaining the records of those who remained unidentified. For some families, the notification had come quickly. Their son had been found and identified within days or weeks of the armistice. His body would be either returned to the United States for burial at home, or, if the family chose, and often they did choose this, he would be interred in one of the permanent American military cemeteries being established on French soil. These cemeteries, the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery, the Wazane American Cemetery, the Aisne-Marne American Cemetery, and others, were carefully maintained, their white crosses and stars of David arranged in precise rows on grounds that the French government had set aside in perpetuity for this purpose. But for other families, the years had brought no such resolution. Their son remained in the category of missing in action. The War Department had no record of a body. There were no reliable witnesses. The circumstances of his disappearance placed him in a situation where recovery and identification were unlikely. These families had been living, for 3 years, in the particular state of grief that has no bottom because it cannot quite confirm its own existence, a grief that could not be completed because the fact around which it organized itself had never been definitively established. Think of what that is like. Think of a mother who has received no notification. Who knows only that her son sailed for France in the spring of 1918 and that letters came for a while, and then the letters stopped, and then there was a telegram saying he was missing, and then there was silence. And she has written to the War Department and received replies saying the investigation is ongoing, and she has talked to men from his unit who came home and none of them saw what happened to him, and she has prayed and hoped and tried to live her life in the ordinary way while carrying within her this open wound that time cannot close because time requires a fact to work with. For these families, the ceremony on November 11, 1921 was something complex. On one hand, it offered a kind of comfort: there would be a grave. There would be a place. If the unknown soldier might be their son, then Arlington might be where their son was. They could go there. They could stand before the tomb. They could place flowers. They could have the experience of standing at a grave, even without the certainty of knowing that it was specifically his grave. On the other hand, the ceremony required them to accept something very hard. It required them to accept the possibility, a certain, acknowledged possibility, that their loved one's remains might literally be there, 3 feet below them, and that they would never know it. That the question would remain permanently open. That the uncertainty was the point, and that it was the uncertainty that made the symbol work, and that for the symbol to serve everyone it could not specifically serve any one of them. Most families, by all accounts, made this accommodation. They found that the universal quality of the unknown soldier, the fact that he could be anyone's son, was its own form of consolation. Grief is a very isolating experience, and one of its particular sorrows is the feeling that no one else can quite reach you where you are. The unknown soldier, paradoxically, did reach people where they were. Because he was unknown, he was intimate in a way that a named soldier could not be. He was not someone else's son. He was everyone's son. There were, however, also families who responded differently. Families who had been hoping, perhaps unreasonably, but hope is not always reasonable, that the ceremony would somehow be connected to an answer. That in the process of choosing and honoring an unknown soldier, some information would emerge that might resolve their particular uncertainty. These families were disappointed, and their disappointment was real and deserved acknowledgement. And there were, in the years to come, families who became convinced, without any evidence that would satisfy a scientist or a bureaucrat, but with the certainty of feeling that the unknown soldier was their man. That the person lying in the tomb at Arlington was their son, their brother, their husband. These families visited the tomb. They spoke to him there. They felt, in some way that they could not entirely articulate, that they had found him. No one told them they were wrong. Part 8: The Guarding of the Tomb. After the ceremony was complete, after the crowds had dispersed and the dignitaries had returned to their cars and their offices and their routines, the tomb of the unknown soldier remained. And someone had to guard it. In the early years after the 1921 burial, the tomb was not continuously guarded in the way it would later become famous for. The public could visit, and did visit in considerable numbers, but there was no formal, round-the-clock guard. This would change in 1937, when Congress officially authorized a continuous guard, and it was the 3rd Infantry Regiment, known as the Old Guard, America's oldest active duty infantry unit, that would eventually take on this responsibility. The sentinel duty at the tomb of the unknown soldier is, by any measure, one of the most exacting and demanding ceremonial duties in any military in the world. Those who perform it are not simply asked to stand at attention and look impressive. They undergo an extraordinary process of selection and training that takes months, and which most candidates do not complete. The sentinels walk exactly 21 steps across the black mat in front of the tomb, then turn, wait 21 seconds, and walk back. The number 21 corresponds to the 21-gun salute, the highest military honor. Their pace is measured. Their posture is precise to a degree that borders on the architectural, the military crease of their uniforms, the angle of their rifle, the position of their chin, all calibrated and maintained to exacting standards. They are tested. Their uniform, a black dress uniform that must be immaculate, is inspected before every shift with a thoroughness that leaves no detail unexamined. A single thread out of place, a single hair disturbed by the wind, a single deviation from the exact prescribed form, and the inspection fails. The sentinel returns to prepare again. They guard in all weather. This is perhaps the thing that most people, learning about the tomb guard, find most remarkable. The sentinels stand their watch in the summer heat of a Virginia August, when the marble of the plaza radiates warmth upward and the air is thick and still. They stand it in the winter cold, when ice forms on the plaza and snow accumulates on their shoulders and the temperature drops well below freezing. They stand it in rain and in thunderstorms. During Hurricane Isabel in 2003, the sentinels remained at their post, guarding the tomb as floodwaters rose around the cemetery and trees came down in the wind. When asked why, when people who see the sentinels in extreme weather ask how they can maintain this duty, the members of the tomb guard have given various answers over the years, but they tend to circle around the same core sentiment. The soldiers buried here, the unknown soldiers, because by 1958 there were 3 unknowns, and for a time 4 endured conditions far worse than any weather a sentinel will face on the plaza. They endured what they endured without complaint, without the option of going inside when it became too uncomfortable. Guarding their rest in all conditions is a way of acknowledging that. The Tomb Guard badge, which is awarded to sentinels who have successfully completed their training and served the required time, is the least awarded badge in the United States Army. Far fewer people have earned it than have received most other military distinctions. It is also one of only 2 Army badges that can be revoked even after a soldier has left active service. If they are found to have conducted themselves in ways that dishonor the tomb, the badge can be taken back. This has happened, though rarely. All of this, the precision, the endurance, the accountability that extends beyond active service, speaks to what the tomb has come to mean in American life. It is not simply a monument. It is not simply a grave, though it is that too. It is a living institution, attended by living people who have chosen to give a portion of their lives to the act of witness. To the act of standing in the presence of the unknown and refusing to look away. There is something very old in this impulse. The instinct to appoint a guardian for the sacred dead goes back as far as human civilization reaches, back to the Egyptian priests who tended the tombs of the pharaohs, to the temple keepers of ancient Greece, to the soldiers who stood watch over the graves of fallen kings in the pre-Christian world. The 3rd Infantry Regiment, standing at the tomb of the unknown soldier in their black uniforms on a winter night in Virginia, are the inheritors of something very deep and very old, even as they do it in a form that is distinctly American, distinctly modern, distinctly of this particular story. Part 9: The Later Unknowns. The story of the unknown soldier does not end with the November 1921 burial. It continues, because the wars did not end. The Second World War came. By the time it ended in 1945, the United States had suffered more than 400,000 military deaths, and once again a significant number of the dead were unidentified. The scale of the conflict, fought across the Pacific Island groups, across North Africa, across the European continent from Normandy to Berlin, meant that the problems of identification were in some ways even more complex than they had been in the First World War. Soldiers were lost at sea. Aircrew were lost in aircraft that went down in remote terrain or deep water. The Pacific Campaign in particular produced situations where identification was extremely difficult, because the fighting was often in environments so far from the logistical systems that supported recovery and recording. The Korean War followed, the conflict that Americans would sometimes call the Forgotten War, fought between 1950 and 1953 on the Korean Peninsula, with American forces fighting under the United Nations flag alongside South Korean allies against North Korean and Chinese forces. Another war, another toll, another accounting of the missing. By the early 1950s, Congress had authorized the selection and burial of additional unknown soldiers, one from the Second World War and one from the Korean War, to join the 1921 unknown at the tomb at Arlington. The ceremony for these two additional burials took place on Memorial Day, May 30, 1958. The selection process for both was similar to the 1921 process: careful identification of genuinely unidentifiable remains from each conflict, followed by a selection ceremony designed to be random and without preference. The remains from the Second World War came from an unknown American who had died somewhere in the European or Pacific theaters of operations. The remains from the Korean conflict came from an unknown American who had died in that conflict. The 1958 ceremony was presided over by President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was himself a general of the Army and had served as Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe during the Second World War. His presence gave the ceremony a particular weight, a commander honoring the men who had served and died under his command, or under commands connected to his, a man who understood from the inside what these deaths had meant. 2 additional marble crypts were added to the tomb plaza. The monument was now flanked on either side by the graves of unknown soldiers from the 2 subsequent conflicts, so that the tomb became, in physical form as well as symbolic form, a representation of multiple generations of American military sacrifice. Then came Vietnam. The Vietnam War was the longest armed conflict in American history at that point, and it produced its own particular tragedy of the missing. The jungle terrain of Southeast Asia, the nature of the fighting, the circumstances of many of the deaths, particularly among aircrew lost over dense jungle or at sea, meant that a significant number of Americans remained unaccounted for after the conflict ended. The POW MIA issue, the question of whether any Americans remained as prisoners of war, and the ongoing effort to account for the missing, became one of the most emotionally charged aspects of the post-Vietnam era. In 1984, a 4th unknown was added to the tomb at Arlington, an unknown soldier from the Vietnam War. The selection and burial process followed the established pattern, and the ceremony was solemn and attended with all the honors that had come to define these occasions. But Vietnam was different in one crucial respect. The science of identification had been changing. Forensic anthropology had advanced significantly in the decades since 1921. The capacity to analyze skeletal remains and determine information about age, sex, stature, physical characteristics, and old injuries had improved dramatically. And beginning in the 1980s, a new technology was becoming available that would eventually transform the entire question of identification: DNA analysis. The Vietnam unknown was designated X-26 in military records, remains that had been recovered and processed and examined and found to be unidentifiable by the methods available at the time. But even as the burial took place in 1984, some members of the military's identification community were not entirely convinced that identification was truly impossible. The technology was improving rapidly. What could not be known today might be knowable tomorrow. In 1998, following years of advocacy by a former POW named Ted Sampley and others, and after significant political and legal maneuvering, the remains were disinterred. A mitochondrial DNA analysis was conducted, and the identification was made. The Vietnam unknown was not unknown anymore. His name was Michael Joseph Blassie. Part 10: The Discovery of Michael Blassie. Michael Blassie was a young Air Force pilot from St. Louis, Missouri. He was 24 years old when he died on May 11, 1972, when his A-37 Dragonfly aircraft was shot down near An Loc in South Vietnam. The aircraft went down in contested territory, and a recovery attempt was made 4 months later, in September 1972, by American forces who located the crash site. What they recovered was partial remains and a few personal effects, including pieces of an officer's identification card, a piece of a flight suit, and a parachute fragment. The identification card fragments suggested a possible identity, but the remains were incomplete and the evidence was considered insufficient for a positive identification. The remains were assigned the designation X-26 and placed in the unknown system. Over the following years, Blassie's family, his mother Jean, his father George, his siblings, lived with the uncertainty that so many families of the missing had lived with. They had never had a body to bury. They had never had a confirmed account of what had happened. They had their loss and their questions, and they had each other, and they had held on. When the Vietnam Unknown was chosen in 1984, something about the circumstances troubled some of the people involved. The evidence connecting X-26 to a specific individual, the fragments of the identification card, had been noted in the file. Some argued that this meant the remains were not truly unidentifiable and should not have been selected. Others argued that the evidence was too fragmentary to support a positive identification and that the selection was appropriate. The disagreement was real, and it would not go away. The political dimensions of the disinterment debate were significant. The tomb of the unknown soldier had become, over nearly 80 years, one of the most sacred sites in American public life. The idea of removing remains from it, of disrupting the physical sanctity of the tomb, was deeply uncomfortable for many people. It felt, to some, like a desecration. It felt like it undermined the symbolic purpose of the unknown, which was to be permanently unknown, permanently representative of everyone who could not be named. But for the Blassie family, and for others who supported them, the question was a different one. The symbolic purpose of the unknown was to honor those who could not be identified. If this particular individual could be identified, if science had advanced to the point where a name could be given to these remains, then the symbolic purpose was actually better served by making the identification. The remains did not need to lie in the unknown's tomb. They could lie in a named grave, honoring a specific man, while the crypt in the tomb remained either empty or awaiting remains that were truly and irrecoverably unidentifiable. In 1998, the Secretary of Defense ordered the disinterment. The testing was conducted. The mitochondrial DNA from the remains was matched against DNA provided by Jean Blassie, Michael's mother. The match was positive. Michael Joseph Blassie, the young Air Force pilot from St. Louis who had flown his last mission on May 11, 1972, who had been shot down over South Vietnam and recovered in fragmentary form 4 months later, who had spent 14 years as the Vietnam Unknown in the Marble Plaza at Arlington, was brought home to his family. He is now buried in Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery in St. Louis, in a named grave, near his hometown, with his name carved in stone. His mother, his father, his siblings, can visit him there. They can stand at a grave and know whose grave it is. The crypt that held him at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Arlington now stands empty. A marker at the tomb notes that the crypt contains no remains. The decision about whether to search for a truly unidentifiable Vietnam-era unknown remains one that has not been resolved, partly because the DNA identification technology that allowed Michael Blassie to be identified has continued to improve, and the military's commitment to accounting for all its missing has been strengthened to the point where it has become very difficult to certify that any remains are truly unidentifiable. There may never be a Vietnam unknown. This is not, perhaps, a tragedy. It is, perhaps, a tribute to how far the science of honoring the dead has come. Part 11, What the Tomb Means. Step back, now, from the specific history, from the caskets and the ceremonies and the DNA analysis and the political arguments, and think about what the tomb of the unknown soldier means. What it has meant, over more than 100 years, to the country that created it and to the people who have visited it. Arlington National Cemetery receives more than 3 million visitors each year. The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is the most visited site within it. People come from every state and many countries. They come on school trips and family vacations and solo pilgrimages. They come in the summer heat and the winter cold. They come dressed for a casual day of sightseeing, and they come in formal attire, as if arriving for church. Many of them have cried at the tomb without expecting to. There is something about the tomb that operates on a level below the intellectual. You can know the history, you can know exactly how the 1921 unknown was selected, and what the Meuse-Argonne offensive was, and who President Harding was, and all the layers of ceremony and symbolism that were built into the event, and still find, when you stand before the marble and hear the sentinel's measured footsteps, that something in you responds to it in a way that bypasses all of that knowledge and goes directly to something older and simpler. Part of what the tomb does is make visible something that is usually invisible: the human cost of the decisions made in the rooms where wars are decided. The unknown soldier is a very specific and concrete reality, a specific set of human remains, in a specific tomb, on a specific hillside in Virginia. He is not an abstraction. He is not a statistic. He is a body, lying in the earth, permanent and factual. And the fact of him, the concreteness of him, the weight and solidity of his presence within that marble structure makes the 116,000 American deaths of the First World War into something that a person can actually encounter, not just read about. Statistics, the saying goes, numb. One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. The unknown soldier is a technique for reversing this. By taking the mass and making it singular, by choosing one body, one nameless individual, and giving that individual the full weight of national attention and ritual and honor, the architects of this ceremony found a way to make the mass graspable. One man. Unknown. Lying in the earth. And in the one man, all the men. There is a parallel here to something very ancient in human religious and ritual practice. The chosen vessel who represents the whole community. The individual sacrifice that stands for all sacrifice. The lamb, in the tradition that shaped Western culture, that carries the sins of the people. The unknown soldier is not, of course, a religious figure in any literal sense. The ceremony at Arlington was carefully non-sectarian, though it included prayers, but he participates in a structure of meaning that runs very deep in human history. What the tomb offers to the families of the missing, specifically, is what might be called a geography of grief. One of the things that mourning requires, in almost every human culture, is a place. A physical location where the loss is gathered and held, where the living can come to be near the dead, where the relationship between the mourner and the mourned can be maintained in some spatial, tangible way. The rituals of mourning are, in large part, rituals of place: the grave, the cemetery, the memorial, the shrine. For families of the missing, this place does not exist in the ordinary way. There is no confirmed grave. There is nowhere specific to go. The grief has nowhere to anchor itself, and so it floats, and the floating of it is its own particular torment. The tomb of the unknown soldier gives these families a place. It is not a certain place. The family of a missing soldier cannot be certain that their man is there. But it is a possible place, and a meaningful place, and a place where the nation has committed itself to honoring all the missing, and that is something. It is, for many people, enough. The tomb has also served, over its 100 years, as a gathering point for national grief at moments of particular sorrow. After the September 11th attacks. After the deaths of presidents. After national tragedies of various kinds. People come to the tomb not because the unknown soldier is directly connected to these events, but because the tomb is the place where the country has established, by 100 years of practice, that loss is honored. It has become the sacred site where grief can be brought and acknowledged. There is something specifically American about the form the tomb takes, and about the way it has been woven into the fabric of American civic life. The United States is a young country by the standards of the nations that maintain similar tombs, and it does not have the accumulated centuries of tradition and ritual that older countries draw on. But it has been making its traditions actively, with deliberate attention to their meaning, and the unknown soldier is one of the most successful of these. It has become, genuinely and without irony, one of the places where the American spirit is most legibly present, not the triumphant America of parades and fireworks, but the quieter America that knows what has been asked of people and does not look away from that knowledge. Part 12. What we carry forward. On a morning in late autumn, a century and more ago, a man with no name was laid in the ground on a green hillside above the Potomac River. Around him stood a president and a king's representative, generals and senators and grieving mothers and veterans who had walked through mud and wire and who bore in their bodies and their memories the permanent traces of what they had endured. Around him stood a nation that was trying to understand what it had done and what it had been asked to pay and whether the price had been worth the cost, a question that no honest person could answer easily, and that most people, on that November morning, were wise enough not to try. What they did instead was simpler and more lasting. They gathered. They were quiet. They listened to a bugle play 24 notes. They watched a flag be folded with precision and care into a triangle of stars. They allowed themselves to feel, without explanation or justification, the weight of what lay in that casket and what that weight represented. In the century that has followed, the world has changed in ways that would have been inconceivable to most of the people standing on that hillside in 1921. Another world war came, and another conflict after that, and another after that, and another. The science of identifying the dead has advanced so far that the category of the truly unknowable has narrowed almost to a point. The men who died in the First World War were buried in an era when the most sophisticated identification tools were visual recognition and personal effects. Men who die today in military service can be identified by DNA to a degree of certainty that approaches absolute. And yet the tomb remains. The sentinels still walk their 21 steps and turn and wait and walk back. The marble monument, completed in 1932, still stands in the plaza at Arlington with its carved inscription. And people still come in their millions, year after year, to stand in front of it and to be quiet for a moment, and to feel whatever it is that the tomb calls up in them. Michael Blassie, whose story we told in an earlier part of this journey, is buried now in a named grave in St. Louis, and the crypt that held him stands empty, a fact acknowledged on a small marker at the tomb itself. This emptiness is, in its own way, part of the story. It is a reminder that the story is not finished. That the question of how to honor the unidentified dead is not one that gets answered once and put away, but one that each generation must take up again with the tools and knowledge that it has. For the two unknowns who remain, the man from the First World War, whose remains lie in the central crypt beneath the great marble monument, and the man from the Second World War, whose crypt is to the east, there is a finality. The DNA database that would be needed to identify them does not exist and could not be assembled now. The families of First World War soldiers are, in nearly all cases, gone. The families of Second World War soldiers are aging past the point where the relevant biological reference samples can be collected. These men will remain unknown. Perhaps that is as it should be. Not every question has an answer. Not every loss has a name. The value of the tomb lies not only in what it holds but in what it acknowledges, that there are things beyond our knowing, sacrifices beyond our full accounting, debts we cannot settle in full, and that the appropriate response to this fact is not to turn away but to stand in its presence with the respect it deserves. The unknown soldier speaks in that silence. Not in words. In the specific language of presence, of the body in the earth, of the human fact that refuses to be entirely dissolved by time. He is unknown. He is everyone. He is, perhaps, the most American of Americans, the man we cannot name but cannot forget, the sacrifice we cannot fully measure but cannot stop trying to honor, the permanent question at the center of the nation's sense of itself. What have we asked of people? What have people given? How do we carry that forward in a way that is worthy of it? Every generation has to answer that question fresh. And every November, on the 11th day, a sentinel walks 21 steps across a marble plaza above the Potomac River, and turns, and waits, and walks back. And the man in the ground beneath, whoever he was, rests in the honored glory that was given to him on a cool, blue November morning in 1921, and that no one has ever taken away. Closing meditation. You have traveled far tonight. Through the mud and the silence of a battlefield in France. Through the Atlantic crossing of a ship moving westward, carrying something precious toward home. Through the streets of Washington in the cold of November, past the crowds and the cannon fire and the folded flag. Through a century of sentinels walking their measured steps in all weather, in all seasons, year after year. Let all of that settle now, softly, the way stories do when they have been told and the telling is complete. Feel the weight of your body resting where you are. Feel the warmth of the covers, or the pillow, or whatever is holding you. Your breathing is slow. Your thoughts are beginning to drift, gently, like leaves on the surface of a wide, still river. The man in the tomb at Arlington is resting. The sentinels will keep their watch tonight, as they have every night for decades. The marble will be cool in the dark, and the stars will be out over Virginia, and the Potomac will move through its wide banks as it always has, carrying the night toward the sea. You carry your own history. Your own quiet sacrifices. Your own unnamed losses and unspoken debts and moments that no official record will ever capture. And they are honored, simply by the fact that you carry them with care. Let your thoughts grow quieter now. Let them slow to a drift. The grass on the hillside is green and still. The flag is folded. The bugle has been played. Rest now. You are safe. You are here. The night is long and quiet and full of stars. Sleep well. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.